I'm Emma and I'm the Assistant Biodiversity Officer. We are the Heart of England Forest. We are based in the Midlands, so between Warwickshire and Worcestershire. Our vision is to plant, protect and conserve a 30,000 acre forest, but we also manage other different habitats on top of that, so like grasslands and wetlands. So our goals are to mitigate climate change, to help our environment, just be a general helping hand for nature really. And we're also here to benefit people. So we have a lot of walks and events, and we have a really good education team as well that help to inspire the future generations that are going to be helping to protect our planet in the future as well. We're here to benefit nature, our environment, the future, and yourselves who also get to come and enjoy our forests. We're really well known for our tree planting goals and creating our beautiful forests, but we also take care of a lot of other different habitats which I mentioned. So tonight we are going to be talking about conservation grazing for our grasslands and the benefits to biodiversity. Conservation grazing is the use of livestock to help improve, maintain and really just, help our habitats like grassland habitats and things like that. So including things like natural grasslands, heathlands, wood pasture and wetlands. And the reason it's so beneficial is that our herbivores allow wildflowers and less competitive flowers to flourish just through things like their grazing, their movement and their behaviour patterns. So for example, one of the benefits is that our animals take up nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, and those nutrients can get recycled into the ground. And if they're recycled into the ground, that can help more dominant invasive plant species to grow through. So if they're growing through more, our rarer, less competitive species, they can't thrive as well because they like things like low nutrient conditions, and the more phosphorus and nitrogen, the more fertile grasslands can become. So if they become more fertile, there's more dominant species, but that doesn't actually support a diverse range of other species such as our invertebrates and mammals that depend on them. So conservation grazing does really help our invertebrates and our biodiversity. So it has like a really positive knock-on effect. So grazing through time. So what I want you to do is just imagine what thousands of years ago, what our land would have looked like. So if you close your eyes and picture in your head what you think the UK's land would have looked like, what do you imagine? It's really interesting to think about this because I hadn't until researching this topic. And when I look at it, I sort of imagine, like really dense closed canopy forests, the sort of forest that you see in films or you read in books and fairy tales and things like that. That's what I imagine, that's what I pictured. But what surprised me was actually the land didn't look like that. So if you come with me thousands and thousands of years ago, and when the land back then was actually shaped by large herbivores. So thousands of years ago, we actually had animals like aurochs, which were our wild ox. We had elk, we had bison, we had tarpons, which were Europe's original wild horse. We had beavers as well and wild boar. So if you imagine all those different animals, their different behaviours, the way that they graze, the way that they disturb the land, it was all really different. So because of these different species roaming the land, they help to shape the landscape and create a really complex mosaic of different habitats, which was really helpful. And the balance of nature back then was, it was kept in check by their natural predators. So, like bears, wolves, lynx, and we just had this really complete ecosystem. And our large mammals that we had, so the aurochs and things like that, they're what we would have known as keystone species. So what that means is a keystone species is a species which is critical to the survival of the other species within that ecosystem. So without them, that ecosystem wouldn't survive. So for example, the aurochs, which were the wild ox, they were the land's heaviest large mammal at the time. And because they were so big, they helped to, shape the landscape. So they weighed about 1,000 kilograms, and they had average heights of around 155 to 180 centimeters. And I don't know if anybody is ever good at imagining measurements, but I'm not. So what I did when I thought of how big is 180 centimeters, I actually measured it against my partner, and I was so shocked to see how big these creatures would have been. So if anybody ever gets a bit bored, just get a tape measure out and just see how big that 180 centimeters is, because it's huge. It really is shocking how big they would have been. So again, because of the size of them, it really helped to develop our land and just helped create this really healthy ecosystem. But over time, because of human populations increasing, it caused a lot of extinctions and displacements of all these species. So that led to problems like compaction of the ground, so a lot of soil disturbance and a lot of overgrazing and things like that. So because of that, we lost a lot of our keystone species, which were super important. So if you fast forward to today, to modern day grazing, you think of how much the land has changed. This is why conservation grazing is so important, because the livestock that we have in modern day times, they act as proxies for Europe's missing megafauna.
I'm Loveday, so I'm the conservation grazing intern. So why graze areas of the forest? Emma has pretty much mentioned most bits, but some really practical things are habitat management. So we don't need to rely on tractors and heavy machinery to maintain grasslands when we buy them up. We can put these animals on and they can keep that habitat, keep the grass down if it is a grassland. And this allows us time basically as well, before, if we're trying to get tree planting permissions without the scrub growing up and without that habitat turning to something else. So that's a really practical use that we use them for. It also means we farm organically. So this has lots of different benefits, but without chemicals and heavy fertilizers on the ground, it encourages natural crop pest predators. It also encourages healthier soils and habitats for lots of different wildlife species and lots of diverse range of plant species, so more invertebrates. Of course, you're also getting an income from that organic beef and lamb generated, and then this can be put back into the charity and back into planting or back into whatever the charity wants to use it for. So that's a really good source of income. I just noticed that chicory on the last slide as well. That's an example of a different species with a really deep root, which might not otherwise be there if there was all those dominant species. So that's good in dry conditions. It's taking up that moisture, especially we've got really clay soils around Dorsington, on some of the farmland. So that's a really good soil improver for structurally, and obviously is a source of nectar and pollen. So benefits then, the main benefits, well, one of the main ones is selective eating. A lot of our conservation grazers are bred to be hardy and to be able to survive on poorer quality species, and they often prefer to eat those dominant plant species. So something like cocksfoot or rye, that's what they'll go for. So they'll weaken those sort of plants, and it leaves a space for variety of different species, more diverse, to establish. So it just means that the sward is a lot more diverse in plant species, and not just one monoculture of rye or clover or whatever it might be. So this picture on the left was taken in spring, and it's a newly emerged little orange tip butterfly. Their caterpillar feeds on this food plant, which is the cuckoo flower or lady smock. And that's just an example of a flower that might not have otherwise been able to survive without those grazes, leaving a little space for that flower to grow and obviously providing lots of nice nectar. These animals obviously do a lot of rooting, a lot of trampling, and this has lots of different benefits. So it can basically creates lots of small little areas of ground, bare ground, which creates more of a mosaic. So it's not just lush pasture, all monoculture across the whole field. It's got different divots and all sorts going on. So this again allows less competitive species to establish, and these are typically early colonizers of disturbed soils. So they need quite poor quality ground to germinate within these patches. And then they can have a little bit of a chance to get going and thrive and flower. So other examples of this are lady's mantle, cowslips, red clover, knapweed, oxeye daisy, lady's bedstraw, and obviously the cuckoo flower that we saw before. So yeah, establishment of new seedlings. And then things like ryegrass and cocksfoot are a bit more controlled. Lots of different invertebrates benefit from this. So butterflies and moths depend on these less dominant species, which might be outcompeted otherwise by more vigorous vegetation. They also use the bare ground to breed, sometimes for nectaring and for basking. So lots of different uses. I think also, I don't know if I mentioned later, but there's lots of solitary bees, like mining bees, sometimes use this bare ground for nesting and creating little nest sites. So that's another benefit. Lying and pushing, further disturbance basically of the ground and also the surrounding vegetation. Those big horns on that longhorn, and also horns on the Jacobs and the Hebridean sheep that we've got, can disrupt brambles and do a little bit of scrub control for us basically. The weight of the animals, like Emma was saying about the aurochs, longhorns obviously are a heavy animal, so that rolling, lying, a little bit of poaching, not obviously too much, can increase biodiversity by breaking up the deep litter and encouraging more spring growth, encouraging those different diversity of plants, making it a more diverse sward. Also birds, this is really beneficial for ground nesting birds, things like lapwings and snipe. They need that sort of variety in the sward height for their nesting. So that's another benefit. Poo, that is a really good fertilizer, natural fertilizer. We don't need to rely on things like heavy chemical nitrogen fertilizers. They've been described as an ecosystem in themselves. So they host a whole host of wildlife, and they'll colonize that cowpat. It's been found that 250 species of insect can be found on the British organic cowpat. So that's a point. With farming organically, it means we have a low input system. So we don't have a heavy chemical impact on the land at all. An example of this is with treating animals for worms. So we only treat our livestock for worms if we absolutely need to. So instead of just routinely treating, we'll take a poo sample, send it off to the vets, and they will specifically tell us if there is a problem, what species of worm we need to target, or if we don't need to do it at all, which really helps reduce that chemical impact on the land by using less medication as well. So this means invertebrates can live in the cowpats and the sheep poo, and that helps decompose the dung, takes all that organic matter down into the soil, which is good for the topsoil, providing natural fertilization. So that's really good. And it obviously spreads over a large bit of ground. So the poo will actually disappear more quickly in an organic system than in a non-organic system. We also manage the grassland in a very controlled way. So not leaving the animals on periods of ground for too long, instead of doing things like chemical worming. And obviously all these insects in the poo provide a brilliant source of food for lots of different animals, birds, foxes, badgers, bats, when we see a lot of swallows in the fields whizzing around. So I think they're enjoying the invertebrates. There's also a problem with anthelmintic resistance. This is basically, if you are routinely worming animals, the worms in the animals can become resistant to the wormer, which is obviously a really big animal health concern if we can't actually fix that problem. So that's a really big benefit of controlling it, making sure you're using the right wormer at the right time or trying to avoid it completely. Here we just have a little common pipistrelle, one of the species that would benefit from lots of insects in the dung. And we have a lovely marbled white nectaring on some knapweed, which is just an example of some of the species that we might want to encourage in a grassland to provide that nectar and pollen throughout the season. So these are some of our clin sheep. We have cattle and sheep at the heart of England at the moment. We have about 200 longhorn cattle, about 200 clin ewes now, We're sort of phasing these out slowly. And then we've got our conservation breeding sheep, about 30 Jacobs, and a very small flock of Hebrideans. So we've got 8 breeding ewes at the moment. And I think Emma is going to go into a little bit more detail about the individual breeds.
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce a couple of our breeds that we have on the farm. So just to introduce you to our Jacob sheep as pictured. They are a lovely, hardy, ancient breed which were established in Britain around the 18th century. They've got a really diverse diet, so they will eat like coarse and fine grasses, but they'll also get up on their hind legs and munch higher bits of vegetation such as hawthorn and bramble. So they're a really good species for assisting with things like scrub control. Not only that, because they're such a robust little species and because they're so small, they're able to get into areas that some of the larger breeds can't. And also because they're quite lightweight, they're really suitable for smaller grazing areas, as well as areas of archaeological importance. And to introduce you to our Hebridean sheep, again, these are pictured. They're a really distinctive breed. You might have seen them out and about in the forest if you live quite locally. They have sort of multi-horns, so pictured here, this one has 2, but they can actually grow, you know, a few more horns. The Jacob sheep can as well, which is really distinctive. And again, as Loveday mentioned, really good for helping with scrub. So they're another hardy, primitive breed like the Jacobs. But when you think of a sheep, so what pops into your head naturally as a sheep is the big white, fluffy, cloud-looking animals. And the reason for this is human selection. So over time, humans have been breeding sheep to be bigger for meat, better for wool. So a lot of our primitive breeds have sort of been neglected. So years and years ago, a lot of our primitive breeds were actually sort of neglected to the rocky outlying areas of Britain. So in areas in the north and in the west, so areas that were colder, with higher altitudes and less, you know, more poorer quality condition for nutrients and things like that. So because of that, a lot of our primitive breeds were lost, but our Hebrideans actually managed to survive. So fast forward to today, that's why they really are one of the best sheep breeds for conservation grazing, because they can survive really well on low nutrient, poor energy value areas, but they can also thrive in it as well. So an example of their success is in the lowland heaths, such as in Skipwith and the Strensall Commons near York and in North Lincolnshire. They've had Hebrideans summer grazing there with their lambs, and they've been doing this for about 3 seasons now. And they've actually prevented the growth of things like invasive birch and pine scrub, and their grazing has actually prevented the spread of acid grassland species such as purple moorgrass, or also known as Molinia. And in just 3 seasons, they've actually managed to eradicate this Molinia in the area. But because of the lightweight and things like that, they've actually not disturbed the heathlands. So a lot of the other heathers and the heath have been able to compete, and they've been able to flourish. So that's had a really positive knock-on effect for the invertebrates, mammals and birds that are dependent on those other species. So they really do help to maintain things like plant species richness, as well as the structural diversity that's needed to support a range of invertebrates and birds and the other wildlife that depend on them as well. Now on to our longhorn cattle. Again, pictured is one of our lovely longhorns, and peeping in the background is one of her calves. These are really large cows. You might, again, if you've been walking through our forests, you might have seen them in some of our areas. These guys represent the aurochs, which were their ancestors, essentially. So they're another hardy ancient breed, and they survive winter by browsing vegetation, and they're not very selective in the diet, so they'll eat a wide variety of vegetation, including such as aggressive weeds, bushy scrub, which, if left unmanaged, they'll dominate the land and prevent a diverse, you know, species-rich grassland. So that's another reason why they're so important. As Loveday mentioned before as well, they've got a greater trampling effect than our smaller species, which creates these really essential microhabitats for our invertebrates and our wildlife. And cattle can actually transport around 230 plant species just in their gut, in their hair, and also in the hooves. So they're a really good natural seed disperser, if you will. So yeah, they're another really good breed for conservation grazing. Okay, so I'll just go into a bit more detail. So when you kind of think, oh, why are all these different breeds so good for conservation grazing? You know, it's beneficial to use a variety of species rather than, you know, just one or the other. So for example, they've got different eating habits, different dietary preferences, different behaviors. So like thousands of years ago, when we had all these different animals, it really does help to create this, you know, mosaic of habitats. So for example, sheep, the way they eat, they bite and shear the grass, and they eat quite close to the ground. So they create sort of tight, short swaths, which is the length of the grass sort of thing, which can be really helpful and beneficial for birds as like a feeding area. And again, because they're so lightweight, they'll cause less disturbance to the soil. Whereas in contrast to cattle, I don't know if anybody's been around cows much, but they have really sharp tongues. It's almost like a razor. And the reason for that is because they're equipped to, the way they eat is that they sort of wrap their tongues around the grass and then pull it up in tufts. So this creates a really diverse sward. So you know, you'll have patches of tall areas, you'll have tussocky areas, and they actually eat a bit higher off the ground than sheep do. And one thing that I find quite interesting is they're quite fussy when it comes to where they've pooed. So if there's an area where they've, you know, like created some dung, they don't eat around it. So what that causes is a bit of taller vegetation. So in the grass where they've been, they'll have this really intricate, diverse sward height with patches of tall grass. And you'll be like, that's where there must be some dung, which is really, again, really helpful for creating this sort of baseline for our biodiversity, for our invertebrates, our birds, and the wildlife that depends on that. And really interestingly, there's a study that was in Sweden, and they used 3 different cattle breeds to graze alpine pastures. And so what they did with this study, they equipped these cows with sort of like collars, and these collars had GPS mapping systems on them, so they could see where the cows were moving. They also had a pedometer on it so that they knew how much they were moving, how long they were lying down for, and they observed their behavior as well within this study. And what they actually found was that different breeds behave differently and had different dietary preferences. So for example, one of the cows, I think it was the Highland cattle, they actually browsed things like shrubs and thistles more than the others. Another breed, I think, were Holstein crosses. They actually walked a lot more of the area and used a lot more of the space. And the other breed ended up using the area more evenly. So it's really interesting to see that, you know, this study, through observing these 3 different breeds, they actually concluded that it's really important to consider the different types of breeds when it comes to conservation grazing. So it's not only important to have different species, so like the sheep and the cows that we've mentioned, but it's also really interesting to consider the different types of breeds and the preferences with that as well. So that's another really important part of conservation grazing in terms of thinking about what habitat you want to have for conservation grazing and what species or breed would be the best to suit that particular habitat. So to conclude, conservation grazing provides many benefits to biodiversity, and again, using the different species and different breeds can help to create these really intricate, complex mosaic of habitats. And we actually are still in the early stages of conservation grazing here at the Heart of England Forest.